At a time when the world was in crisis, in the bloody 17th century, when some historians think 1/3 of the world's population died, a couple of scientists in Western Europe developed a system that would utterly change the world. At the time, most people lived in grueling poverty, with daily routines that had scarcely changed since the invention of agriculture 10,000 years earlier, while worshipping gods and ruled by kings and feudal landlords. However, after the scientific method, everything changed. The world charged headlong into globalization and industrialization. The world's population over the next 350 years went up 10 times over. Humans mastered nature, and we went from a world where people barely made it through scrounging for food to one where 2 billion people were obese. From one where women spent their lives birthing 10 children, hoping half of them would make it, to one in which they were emancipated and legal equals to men. However, with all these gains, what have the costs of modern science been? All great things in the world of men go to sin, and what are the costs that the scientific revolution has created upon modern society? Buckle up for a story dismantling one of the sacred cows of our modern culture, something that few would write about since it's just too close to home. Much of modern science is spent trying to understand the cosmos around us, with space being one of the most popular studies and drawing lots of attention from the public. Space is really fascinating, and learning about it can be awe-inspiring, something that the Magellan series, Cosmic Vistas, shows beautifully. The series covers topics like far-off moons, the sun, the northern lights, and really puts into perspective how little we know about the vast cosmos. This excellent series is on Magellan TV, a documentary streaming service made by filmmakers with the best selection of movies and historical documentaries out there. They have content covering a wide range of topics, including history, astronomy, true crime, and nature. Magellan's compatible just about any device and is 4K HD with no additional cost. It's a great platform for an affordable price. What If Altist viewers get a 1-month free trial using the link in the description below. Magellan TV's for you, so check out Magellan TV today and start learning about whatever your passion is. We live in a world made by science. I'm sitting in a mall's food court writing this episode, looking around at people eating food shipped hundreds or thousands of miles, refrigerated, by train, plane, or automobile. There are large fluorescent lights, mini suns above me, while I'm writing on a laptop. You could go through how technology has revolutionized every single aspect of our lives to a degree that almost seems absurd. Even something as basic as gardening, which you'd think would be exactly the same as 5,000 years ago, has changed markedly due to the invention of fertilizers. It goes from how our population has been able to go up by a factor of 8 in the last 200 years, how we can communicate instantaneously, how it doesn't take 11 hours a week to wash the dishes and clothes and like. When the first atom bomb was dropped, the only comparison the scientist who made it could make to illuminate its power was with the Hindu god of destruction. There's a very fascinating book called The Knowledge Machine, and it's about how science developed and what allowed the massive technological advances of recent centuries. The argument that the author makes about what separates science from other philosophies is that science is willing to make a sacrifice of something called the Iron Rule. The Iron Rule goes that you can only have a scientific debate by arguing over empirical evidence, and from that, you must make an experiment where one set of the results will disprove one side of the debate and prove the other. The Iron Rule puts a massive emphasis on real physical evidence and narrows the mind, cutting out broader theories, philosophy, and the like. For evidence to see what the world looks like without the Iron Rule and why science has been so insanely successful, look at the humanities. The humanities, with history being an example, has no method to objectively prove which point's correct. I mean, just look at my debates with communists, where from my perspective, the 80 million people killed by communism is evidence enough that communism is evil and a failure, while for communists, that definitionally wasn't real communism. This is what the debates in previous versions of science, like that between Plato and Aristotle, was like, with no way to disprove a theory in the same way we can objectively see that the sun doesn't revolve around the Earth, since both sides under the Iron Rule agree to submit themselves to a shared arbitration method. The author, Michael Stravins, goes through how societies incentivize scientists to do the tedious task of accumulating large amounts of evidence without thinking about the broader world. He talks about the anti-curiosity of modern scientific culture. how scientists don't leave their discipline or think about broader matters. He uses quotes from figures like Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins, and other key scientists saying philosophy has absolutely no application, and he described it as a sort of sermon to scientists who just sit down and count their numbers and do their fucking job. The argument I would like to make is that the iron rule is possibly the greatest invention in the history of man. However, our society, upon seeing its remarkable results, has since tried to apply that principle to every aspect of our culture, which has created disastrous effects. Possibly the most renowned scholar of religion in the last century, Huston Smith, has a fascinating point of the nature of science, in that he refers to it as a searchlight that can pinpoint a single place in the sky, but is incapable of seeing the whole sky and all the stars that are in it. This is literally the nature of the iron rule, however, and that science is so powerful, and that it keeps its focus small and on very particular pieces of empirical data. However, the things that are foundational to the way we view the world aren't inherently scientific, and are by nature irrational, since you can't build a worldview off science, since science is just a way of processing information. The things that build our worldviews and the ways we understand reality, or liberalism, Christianity, feminism, and more, aren't in any way scientific. We throw around the term, the evidence says, too much in our society, given that most people have no idea how much the scientific process is driven off subjective variables. Most scientific studies today aren't replicated, which means a scientist can bullshit data and almost no one will catch them. Scientific studies paid for by certain sponsors are 4 times as likely to get results that benefit that sponsor than independently funded science. If you look over history, science has done a poor job of keeping a consistent view of the world. On top of this, data is incredibly easy to skew or portray in a certain light. I've said this a couple times before, but 100 years ago, the scientific consensus believed that races were discrete things with differing abilities, that the best way to manage an economy was with central planning, and competition was bad for the economy. That all men wanted to secretly kill their fathers and sleep with their mother, that the universe worked on perfect clockwork Newtonian principles. Alternately, even 30 years ago, people believed that all prehistoric and tribal peoples were inherently peaceful, which is completely insane if you don't massively skew the data, which the scientists involved did. Another thing that we don't really like to think about as a society is how often entire scientific theories of the world from which we make massive social policies that affect billions of people are often created by not having really any thorough science. And just because it's a popular idea, the academics involved side with it, and it becomes the majority opinion that requires massive amounts of research to disprove. An example of this comes from a fascinating book I read recently called Johann Hari's Lost Connections, and it's about how people used to believe that depression was caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain and wasn't related to the rest of your life. And through taking antidepressants, you could deal with that. However, what they found was that there was absolutely no evidence and no actual scientific studies that depression was caused by a chemical imbalance in your brain and not the rest of your life. And also, there were no studies that proved the efficacy of antidepressants, which actually work in the same range as a placebo and have no effectiveness. And so this entire theory of psychology was based upon really bad evidence that was pushed because the drug companies had so much money. Other examples are the theories that support Rousseau's view of the noble savage, where I said earlier there was absolutely no evidence that tribal peoples didn't wage war, or that tribal societies were open, free love, sexual paradises, which Margaret Mead wrote in her book about Samoa. However, the reality is that she was being tricked by the local Samoan population, and they actually have very strict sexual taboos. But this book became the foundation for decades of leftist thought. Another example of this is the gender spectrum, in which no scientist actually came out and made a scientific argument from anthropological or biological evidence for a gender spectrum. It was something invented by ex-communist writers in the middle of the 20th century with backgrounds in literature. But now we're designing social policy around something that a bunch of literature majors kind of made up. And this is the problem you see in science, where we act as if the things we have discovered with science are immutably true and perfect, but at the same time, it's often just a couple people made an argument in academia, and then because people liked hearing their argument, it became the standard opinion. What ends up happening, since these academics build their careers around their ideas, and thus if you invalidate one of their ideas, you invalidate their whole career, is that as an idea gets entrenched, It's incredibly difficult to remove and requires an impossible amount of evidence over decades to change the academic consensus on an idea, even if that idea wasn't built on strong evidence in the first place. I'm going to use Skinner's behaviorism as an example of this, where Skinner was this scientist who used experiments with rats and pigeons to say that animals don't experience authentic emotions and it's all just conditioning in their childhoods. And this was an idea that was also expanded upon to humans. And this idea is just insane, where tell me the dog that always bounces up and down and rubs its head against you when you get back from home doesn't genuinely love you. Or tell me that if you kill an elephant's sister, that elephant's not going to be angry. And why wouldn't mammals show emotions? Because we're mammals and we have emotions. But what this allowed really was for the horrifying treatment of animals in meat factories. God, I hate that term. And we could treat animals terribly because they never had authentic emotions, according to Skinner. But Skinner's theories took decades to disprove. The incentive structure involved with the iron rule creates a problematic social model. The functioning of the iron rule demands the scientists involved ignore everything except their objective evidence and disparage other fields as a compensation for them cutting off their minds from other ways of thinking. Since scientists get real-world results, society listens to scientists and assumes science is everything. But part of the reason science is so powerful is because it's so limited. However, something to keep in mind is that decisions in countries aren't made by their greatest geniuses, but by the broad crowds or those who happen to end up in power. And culture is never determined rationally and kinda just happens. What happened with science is that people saw the massive improvements that came with the scientific revolution, and without thinking more deeply assumed science was magical and could fix everything. They assumed that the things they naturally assumed to be true were scientific. What ends up happening is that due to science's massive real-world gains, normal people try to replicate the external forms of science without actually understanding science's purpose and its strengths and weaknesses. What ends up happening culturally is that since science cannot determine values, people bring their values into science, and then come out with the assumption that science validates their belief as a mirror. This is how all sides of the political compass have gone through a phase where they assume their values to be inherently scientific and infallible. In this video, I go through this whole process in more detail. Thus, the first weakness that modern society gets from the iron rule is arrogance. If you look at modern society, when we push for a policy, we go full out since we believe the information we have is completely accurate. Look at the 20th century's totalitarian regimes, pushing wholeheartedly towards scientifically provable utopias as they believe them, either with the Übermenschen or true communism. Look at how social justice takes its beliefs to be an objective truth, and any criticism of it is evil. Look at how neoliberal economies believe that they're capable of revolutionizing the world and succeeding for everyone, everywhere, all the time. This arrogance is how modern society can culturally shift so fast, since we believe the thing we're changing towards has been scientifically proven to be objectively better. The story of the modern world has been the single-minded drive for progress, which then leads us into various quandaries of going too hard. Look at the world wars, the threat of nuclear holocaust during the Cold War, totalitarianism, and right now, how most of the world's great economies are having crippling population collapse that will destroy their societies, and Western countries are experiencing social collapse in a bunch of ways, alongside the famines that are projected to occur over the next few years and global warming. Another aspect of this is the modern world's single-minded drive for principles to uphold the world. To support immigration is to support immigration under all circumstances. To be a libertarian or communist is to push those fundamental economic or legal views into every aspect of life. The modern world looks for Newton's laws of motion to apply to human nature, but things are never that simple. Immigration might be amazing in one society and terrible in another. Greater wealth might make one country more free and another more authoritarian. Another aspect of the iron rule is the lack of common sense that is going through our society. Scientists are told to explicitly put away any preconceptions and common sense filters while doing scientific experiments so to not create bias. But action in the real world is much more complicated. Look at modern art, which looks like this, but everyone knows looks worse than this. However, from starting from the principle that all subjective things are equal, which we put above our common sense, we say that they must be equal even though our common sense, gut instinct, and intuition would say otherwise. With common sense, you can immediately say NFTs are ridiculous or that men and women have ingrained personality differences, but since we have no appeal to common sense in our society, you can't make that argument. Common sense would say that increasing immigration and exporting industrial jobs would result in lower wages, but some economists said otherwise, thus making it a scientific principle, thus meaning we could ignore what would otherwise be economic common sense. However, the iron rule trains us to ignore our whole minds and intuition is often the thing that keeps us out of trouble. My friend once told me in dating you need to trust your intuition, since in dating we make decisions that are so complicated with a complicated list of values that we can't consciously understand, but are still wise in a deep level in many cases. Well, if we cherry pick a couple of values like wealth, age, height, breast size, etc., it leaves us lost in the millions of other variables that only intuition can find. The iron rule, or making experiments with very clear rules and thinking that develops from it, makes our societies very bad at seeing context. When the US invaded Iraq, we thought the locals would greet us as liberators, since we were starting with the principle that democracy was good, while not seeing the context that we were conquering their country. When the same Bush administration started their testing program to identify failing schools, they didn't think out the context about what made those schools bad in the first place, ignoring the bigger picture, thus worsening the broader educational standards. Perhaps the saddest part of the iron rule is disenchantment with the world. We are the only historic era I know of which views the world as a boring place. We act as if the world is a boring, safe, predictable place where nothing interesting happens. You can see this in our pop culture, in which whenever we have adventure or interesting stories, we put them in fantasy worlds, unlike other eras of history which put them in history or in far-off lands, since the sacrifices made for the Iron Rule demand we view the world dispassionately and not as an inherently adventurous or crazy place. The truth is that the world's an absolutely fascinating place. Stars are crushing against each other in space, breaking and warping time itself to create black holes that literally consume matter and send it to another reality. There are rivers in New Guinea filled with 25-foot crocodiles, surrounded by jungles more savage than Jurassic Park. The drug ayahuasca literally lets you talk to God, and a 21-year-old boy named Alexander conquered the known world. However, in the modern world, we show very little interest in the world in general. Society doesn't think about space, history, nature, or other cultures that much. Almost all of our cultural content is a masturbatory reflection of our own culture, whether through sitcoms like The Simpsons or the Marvel universes parallel to our current society. The sociologist Max Weber talks about how we've disenchanted the world through the scientific revolution, by getting rid of the idea that the world is a mystical, meaningful place. I view the world I live and walk through as if it was a fantasy novel, and in the same way someone would desperately want to live in the world of Game of Thrones or Star Wars, because I think our world is inherently as interesting as any fantasy world you could invent. There's really no logical reason to not view the world that way. Modern society is in most ways relativist and postmodern, in that the ruling ideology of modern Western countries is you cannot judge someone for subjective differences, like what religion they are, how hard they work, who they sleep with, and the like. However, the logical endpoint in believing in a subjective worldview is to believe whatever makes you happiest. Thus, if you can choose to view the world as a beautiful, mysterious, incredible place that we have a privilege to live in, why wouldn't you? That worldview is as much, if not much more true than viewing the world as a depressing, uninspiring, boring place. Likewise, I hear lots of people say life has no meaning, which is really a non-argument. If you really are a subjectivist, you would say that the argument that life has no meaning, and you can just choose to live a life with meaning. Likewise, a truly subjectivist worldview would have no problem with societies enforcing meaning on their populations if it results in greater happiness and better social results, because once you really get to the point where nothing has any meaning, you don't even have an argument to argue against that. In other words, the complete apathy the Iron Rule has for the world outside its scientific argument cannot work in the real world. We cannot hold massive parts of the world in apathy since we must deal with them. Subjectivism, or not caring, is not a real option in that we as humans are animals who are genetically wired to have to care about things. Thus, those who push subjective worldviews balance their unrealistic worldview by ending up being the most intolerant of dissent of anyone today. The people who will tell you exactly what to believe the most now are those who will also say they're the most open-minded. However, the parroting of the iron rule in the rest of society means we live with a worldview that is terrified of any kind of abstraction. There are no social institutions to talk about life's meaning or what the purpose of our existences might be. To theorize about bigger ideas is almost taboo in most of modern society. For a look at this in the academic history world, in modern academia, the idea that history might have lessons or meanings inherent in it is taboo to study. You just have to accumulate evidence and work for the knowledge machine, with higher level abstraction being taboo. Before World War II, academic historians were continually looking for the factors that resulted in the Roman Empire's rise and fall, China's decay, and the like, but Peter Turchin, who is very much the exception, is the only figure who I can think of who does this today. A big reason I'm able to be a professional public intellectual is the internet creates a void for higher-level reasoning and spitballing to invent new ideas that academia simply blocks due to its misapplication of the iron rule. The truth of the matter is that humans need to be able to dream and have broader-level theorizing about the world in order for life to be worth living. For just one example, a book that really changed my worldview was The Worm at the Core, which is a brilliant book about how death informs and drives every single aspect of our lives, and how you can trace the whole of the human experience from the knowledge that we must die. But one other thing it touches upon is our inability to conceptualize our value as humans before death. To give ourselves a place in the world and a story that explains our suffering, we start to wilt. This is why every single society in history has myths and an idea of the afterlife. We need to have stories that aren't scientifically verified to not wilt and die before how hard life is. There's no way you can structure values or stories or a narrative around science because it's just a fundamentally different way of thinking. For example, there's no way to prove if, say, the fascists or the communists were worse, or what even a concept of worst would be. And it's all dependent upon your values, what you're trying to get, and how you were raised. A big problem we have is that we treat myths as the same as scientific facts. An example of what myths can do is when I dropped out of college, I felt nervous. Well, strangely enough, mind you, both of my parents told me dropping out was a good idea. But my father said every single one of your ancestors decided to get on a 3-month voyage in a rickety boat where lots of people died to go to a strange continent where they had nothing. That made me realize I could do this, and I successfully dropped out and established myself as a financially stable adult. Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning, whether or not you agree with his other political opinions, is a brilliant book about why people are willing to die for their stories. The story is a way of navigating how to act in the world. When Westerners uphold the story of the brave 300 holding against the Persians, although the story has been exaggerated, it provides an example of what men with honor can do. And if I was holding a trench against an unstoppable Chinese horde in the next war, I would love to have that as an example. The founders of the Christian church knew this, and said the stories in the Old Testament, like Noah's Ark or Adam and Eve, were symbols for correct conduct, as were almost all of the religions of their time had a similar view, and is still the case with Hinduism and Buddhism today. When scientists take down religions for the facts being wrong, they ignore the spiritual symbolism that goes with them, rather than taking them at face value. An example of this is from René Girard's book, And I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, which uses Christ's resurrection as a story to show how the only way to escape the endless cycle of human status-seeking and competition is by holding onto an abstract idea of goodness, which explains why a story about a carpenter's son dying on a cross 2,000 years ago has been able to support multiple civilizations, which just doesn't square unless you take a symbolic view of it. Humans need to be able to use our imaginations and dream to be able to live. The view of humanity we have is a combination of the blank slate, where we see humans as malleable things that can be crafted by their societies to be anything without any pre-existing programming, and the factory, where things have to be mass-produced and uniform to be as efficient as possible. The reality is humans are more like plants being cultivated in a garden. We need basic preconditions like soil, water, air, and the like, but different kinds of plants which need each other need different conditions and grow differently. You can't just take a plant and change its conditions and assume it will grow as well. At the same time, we need air and space to grow, and we need to be able to grow towards the sun, and our imaginations, myths, and dreams are the only ways we know what way we want to grow. What a faultist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, or subscribe. As always, thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for future videos, and have a wonderful day.